Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session where I'm going to be chatting with a gentleman that is with HelpSystems here in a role that I think is extremely important to anybody who is having a security discussion at their own organization. And we're going to try and squeak some insights out of him here and get some ideas as to how management looks at IBM and looks at the idea of funding security projects so that we can perhaps rally those needed changes down the line a little bit further. My name is Robin Tatam. I'm the Director of Security Technologies over here at HelpSystems and one of your usual presenters, so I know a lot of you know me, and it's a pleasure to be able to be back with you today. But I thought I'd share the stage a little bit here with Chris Reffkin. And Chris, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and just kind of explain your basic role here at HelpSystems, and then we'll get into a little bit more depth about exactly what you do and why you do that as part of our conversation.
Sounds good. Again, my name is Chris Reffkin. I've been in cybersecurity well before cybersecurity was a buzzword. It's been about 15 years or so. I began as a penetration tester. Today it's evolved into what would be considered a red hat hacker, if you will, but ethical hacking nonetheless. And along with that type of security work, I've also performed security assessments, very heavy in the regulatory and compliance space in all major industries, especially in healthcare and finance. And funny stories from all different industries, whether casinos or solar panel manufacturers to global transportation companies. So all kinds of good stories over the years. How long of what I'm doing at HelpSystems today, or what my role is, as Robin mentioned, this is a new role for HelpSystems, and I've been in the role for about a few months now. And really my mandate is a couple-fold. First and foremost, looking to our customers, serving our customer needs from your requirements. Second, looking to protect our organization from a cybersecurity standpoint. Third, also looking at what our product lines need from a security standpoint, and providing some insights and input into the testing program and structures and services we provide through our various product lines. And then also look after our acquisition strategy and processes as we look to grow the portfolio of services we are able to provide to our customers. And then fifth is our global footprint. So we are a global organization, truly global, operating in about 12, 13 countries, and also keeping that top of mind as well, which is requiring regular liaison with our legal officer and others throughout the organization.
Fantastic. Well, it's definitely a pleasure to have you here. I know you're going to have a lot of very valuable information to share with people. And I've kind of put out just a very basic agenda. We're going to keep this relatively informal. We think that the ideas and discussion, I think, will be pretty fluid. But just to give you some idea of where the areas of discussion will go, we want to understand, I think, Chris, a little bit more about what the role of a CISO is, how that differs perhaps from some of the existing roles that we may be familiar with, and whether everybody has or needs a CISO in their organization. We'll talk about some of the flavor of the month threats, if you will, what's on your radar at the moment, what keeps you up at night, and get some idea of what's kind of motivating the criminal elements or threats to not only our database, but also our technology. We'll introduce kind of where we're at as far as things to be aware of in this day and age. What are some of the trends and in general awareness ideas that come across our plates in the security field, so that we have a feel for that as well. Of course, most people that are listening probably are running on IBM technology, power servers. So we want to talk a little bit about how we are impacted as a brand within that space. Chris, you have some background on power. I have a lot of background in power, so I think between us we'll be able to tie off on that one pretty well. And then arguably one of the most important things is a challenge that tends to be faced by a lot of people in our community, which is how we go about funding security projects. And we're going to be interested in how management looks at these technology requests, these funding requests for cybersecurity, especially in the power realm, because that tends to be kind of an ongoing challenge for people, is to kind of transition from the idea of, yes, we know maybe there's things we should be doing, but nobody wants to write a check to accomplish it. If you do have questions as we go through, feel free to shoot those to us. We'll definitely have some time at the end to address those. If you have a question related to what we're talking about and want to ask Chris, try to feed that in as well, and we can go down that rabbit hole any way we want to. So looking forward to this, Chris. So what I'd like to do is just kind of start off understanding a little bit more of about the role of a CISO. So I think many of us are familiar with the idea of a CIO, right? A Chief Information Officer. We've seen the CISO role evolve over the last several years. What does a CISO in essence mean to you, and how does that differ from the traditional CIO role that we tend to be familiar with?
Well, the first part is there's no typical role. I would say there's maybe an 80-20 role, because there's a spectrum of CISO capability or preference or passion out there. And what I mean by that is you can have CISOs that are on one side of the scale, very technical oriented, kind of come up the ranks through incident response teams, hacking teams, things like that. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you can have folks that are more business orientated, more compliance orientated, and not necessarily that same technical depth. And what brings them together is what's in the middle. And really the main difference between a CIO and a CISO is the operational mandate to be a risk manager. I mean, at the end of the day, my role is not to say no to something. At the end of the day, my role is to say, all right, well, if you want to do this or procure that, here are the risks that we're going to take on. Here are the available mitigating or compensating controls, and ultimately, is this risk acceptable to the organization or not? That is my role here today, not only here at HelpSystems, but also other CISOs out there, is really risk management, information security risk management.
Absolutely, and I certainly encounter the same thing. And risk tends to be a conversation that a lot of people on the technology field are not familiar with. We feel like we have to mitigate everything because if there's a threat, right? But at the end of the day, like you said, it comes down to we're most likely not going to be able to address everything. So how do we prioritize those items? And the impact of that threat occurring, as well as the likelihood of that threat occurring, certainly influences that.
Yeah, and I think one of the bigger pieces too is that you can go the formal route of having an enterprise risk management program, and that's a philosophical debate we could have for another time of how effective they are as opposed to a checklist item. But really, it comes down to what's it worth to the business. So if you're in the business of selling widgets, this shade of risk, is that acceptable to close a next deal, yes or no? And getting the business at the table to have those discussions as opposed to making them in a silo, that's also an important aspect of implementing that risk management type of role, where you're a collaborator, you're communicating, and you're not sitting in the room with the blinky lights issuing go, no go decisions without anybody understanding what you're doing.
Sure. Yep. I mean, none of this works in a vacuum, and so it's important to gather all that stuff. So in a typical organization, as a CISO, who would that role report to? Is that something that goes up to the business units? Is that going directly to the CEO, CFO? Is there a standard that would be seen there?
There's no typical, there's no standard. Depending upon the size of the organization, you can have a CISO reporting up through risk management. I've seen the CISO reporting up through legal. I've seen the CISO reporting directly to the CEO. It really depends upon the broader structure of the organization, as well as the size of the organization of where the CISO is going to report to.
Got it. Well, and you mentioned, the concept that you're not sitting there giving a go no go type decision. It's more about assessing risk. But without getting into too much depth yet, because we're going to talk about this further, but where are you getting that information from? Is that outside sources? Do you have traditionally a team that would funnel these requirements up to you? Who are you expecting to get requests from with regards to perhaps technology acquisitions or service functions that need to be performed?
Honestly, my expectation is that every member of the workforce, if they have a concern or an opportunity for improvement or something that they are not certain about, raises their hand and sends me a note or stops by the office. Great example. Just the other week, I had somebody swing by my office with a concern. Someone I would say in mid-management, if you will, no one I would necessarily have regular contact with. He's like, hey, I wanted to run this by you. What's the scenario? Yep, that's exactly right. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. It's almost the obvious to understand that, yeah, if you're going to acquire a company, you want to be at the table, or if there's a big product initiative, you want to be at that table or this or in some other table. But it's really the day-to-day workings of the strategy of the people implementing the strategies that are going to really see things that you really want to tweak. The bigger ticket items like acquisition, security strategy, you can put together a checklist, you can go through the bases. More than likely, you're going to be able to manage that pretty well. But it's the things that almost get, I don't want to say swept aside, but overlooked, that day-to-day operational implementation of processes where there's always room for improvement, and you could probably have the greatest degree of reducing your risk by better managing some of those areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I know when I speak to management teams, one of the big encouragement items I have is, the concept of this see something, say something, or some flavor of that, which I think many of us who travel are familiar with from an airline security perspective. But the idea being that, if you can empower your employees to feel comfortable with bringing concerns to the table, then there's going to be much better visibility. There's more, eyes on the prize when it comes to questionable functions that are being performed or the way they're being performed, so that we can address them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that I think I know I run into is when we talk to people out in the IBMI community, and I'm sure this holds true across the board, there's an immediate perception when we talk about cybersecurity that it's all about data breaches. We use that term pretty loosely and generically, or data loss. Is it all about data loss to you? Are there other aspects of cybersecurity that become relevant? And the reason I ask that is, had a customer very recently indicate to me that they had internal discussions about their security, and they had decided that their data was extremely proprietary to them, and should that data be lost or stolen, that it would, in their words, end up on the bargain table on the dark web. That it really had very little value. And so they perceived that data protection and cybersecurity were kind of interchangeable and not necessarily important. Do you look beyond that, or is this very much about a data security message?
Again, and I love my job because I can always start an answer to a question with "it depends." The driver is really going to be industry focused, or your business focused. So let's say, for example, you're a health system. The confidentiality of information is going to be paramount, in addition to availability, in addition to integrity. One of the I would say realized risks to electronic medical records is copy and paste errors. Physicians and others within the offices are just copying, pasting from one file to another file to expedite their scribe time, and it's causing issues in patient files, and it could actually have dire consequences if you copy and paste the incorrect information. So that's an integrity issue as opposed to a confidentiality or availability issue. On the flip side, or not a flip side, but on a different lens, I've had some customers and clients of mine who I would say are in the fairly same boat, where there's would say that we don't have information that we consider utmost confidential, or if we get breached, it's not the end of the world. Okay, well, what do you care about? Well, we operate a global franchise organization, and we want to be able to receive essentially our payment from our franchisees. So it's really a availability discussion. And so it's not necessarily the compromise of data or loss of data, but it's ensuring that our systems and services are available so we can recognize revenue. So again, it goes back to really your driver of your business and likely your overall industry of what your priorities are going to be. And so of course we have questions and concerns about availability, confidentiality, integrity, and then the fourth piece is sometimes that I just talk about a safety. You can have a safety impact to possibly your customers or those that are your stakeholders, where if a system goes down or is compromised, you could actually transition from a cyber threat, if you will, to a physical threat. Those are the scenarios of the dams in upstate New York getting hacked, or the third or fourth party suppliers to the Northwest power grid getting hacked, where you could have power outages and things of that nature, and again, transition from that cyber threat to a real world threat and actually cause physical harm or safety concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, for that particular customer, they had identified that if the business application they used that was related to their industry was unavailable for some reason, it was a complete showstopper for them. So it was much more about the integrity of the data in tracking the devices that they used in their business line, and being able to protect the business functionality much more so than it was about the data. So I just opened up a quick poll here. Interested in feedback about what you have as a priority at your organization when it comes to cybersecurity. Looks so far that outside attackers definitely are up there, probably no big surprise there, but also compliance with regulatory requirement. And Chris, I mean, how does that influence you when it comes to an initiative that you engage in? Is that driven more by regulatory compliance? Is there more urgency that is associated with regulatory compliance because at the end of the day, somebody's going to call you out on it? Or is it about just internal best practices for security?
It's a mix. The regulatory compliance aspect is definitely top of mind. Not only is it a very litigious society these days when it comes to cyber events, due to various other reasons in the media and marketing, and organizations that specialize in communications related to breaches, I think, have this spin or fog around what that means. And so from a litigious standpoint, people have compliance with regulatory requirements top of mind, but it really should be defining your overall security program and then incorporating those compliance and regulatory requirements and umbrella. So I don't see them as a leading indicator, but more of something that I incorporate into my program to ensure that I'm covering all the bases that we need to cover.
Sure, absolutely. And we know for a fact, certainly within the IBMI community, a lot of times that we're not doing anything unless we're forced to. And so we see regulations like GDPR and PCI kind of driving the difference between a general interest and inquiry into actually doing something that takes effect and moves the needle a little bit. So, what are three things that you, as a role, might have on your whiteboard over the next 12 months? Are there three immediate takeaways that CISOs around the world are looking at, saying this is percolated up and is definitely something that we need to act upon?
There definitely are, and I do have more than three things on my whiteboard, full disclosure. But
I'm sure.
There's three things that I've singled out here. One, funny enough, is the regulatory landscape. Things like CCPA in California, depending upon your industry, the high-tech industry is getting heavily scrutinized these days. And so there's a lot of things that are happening that there's just a lot of unknown. CCPA is set to launch here January 2020 with enforcement mid-year. There's still questions in the air about it. What's going to happen with Google and Facebook and all the other platforms that are making the rounds in front of Congress and the EU? There are a lot of questions with that as well. And so it's starting to talk to the privacy officers, talk with compliance, and start being prepared, not necessarily to have specific answers, but having those discussions, those dialogues internally about what should we be prepared about, what should we be thinking about that we're not thinking about today, so that if and when something dramatically changes, we have a good story to tell. We can be honest and stand up and say, yep, these are the things that we're doing. Everybody can always improve, but yep, we're confident in our approach today. And so really that collaboration with other folks throughout the organization, compliance, privacy, related to regulatory requirements and the evolving legislative landscape, let's say here, is definitely top of mind.
Okay. Well, I know a lot of people responded that outside threat was their primary concern, but I know inside threat certainly is a common discussion point. Do you approach those threats the same way, or are they treated the same, or are there aspects that are very unique to one versus the other?
I don't think inside or outside, they're not treated the same way, but it's more of the different control sets that you can implement to address those threats. So, for example, you can have a malicious actor on the outside or the inside. Somebody on the inside, you want to have good access controls in place. You have a rogue employee, so they should only have access to what they need to have access to. You need to have good monitoring. You need to have good training for other employees, and you need to have good incident response processes and escalation processes. So if you do happen to get logs or alerts that somebody's attempting to access they shouldn't have access to repeatedly, that somebody addresses those and follows up and performs an investigation and find out what's going on. Conversely, on the outside, you need to have the basic controls in place to block the person at Starbucks from trying to hack into your organization. And so, start with a firewall. What other services do you have exposed to the internet, such as applications? Do you have those appropriately secured and monitored? And so they're similar in kind of thinking about big picture of laying in security, though just a little bit different in the controls that you would implement to address those risks.
Got it. Well, you heard it here, folks. Just because Bob's worked in the accounting department for 20 years doesn't mean we shouldn't be having the appropriate controls in place for that activity. And the other thing from my perspective that I always offer up is we tend to think when bad actors come in from outside that they're coming in as some phantom account. And reality is invariably they're going to be connecting as one of your legitimate users. And so if those users have the keys to the kingdom unnecessarily, then it opens up possibilities of somebody being able to do more, even if it was just somebody else purporting to be who they had created a profile for.
And I have a pretty good real life scenario for that. You mentioned Bob in accounting. There was one financial institution I was working with that mandated that everybody has to take a 2-week contiguous vacation. And that was a legacy financial control in an attempt to identify potential fraud or malicious activity. And this one time, this loan officer who was responsible for taking notes for loan meetings where they would set interest rates on for the organization. She was modifying her loan rates, or not her loan rates, her account rates differently than others. And until she took this 2-week vacation, nobody found out. And it's because some other processes broke down as well that were essentially covering up. And so, yep, somebody could be there for a long time, but it could be something as perceivingly innocuous as taking notes and not sending out those notes to somebody else to allow somebody else to verify what was decided during a meeting was uncovered because they forced somebody to take 2 weeks of vacation.
Interesting, the tricks that can be used and then used against it, right?
Yep.
So you mentioned that we have a lot of offices around the world as HelpSystems, and so as our CISO, we're going to have people listening in from lots of different areas. Each of those regions tends to have different rules and regulations when it comes to data protection. How does that influence us and you as a CISO when it comes to juggling all of these different requirements? Is there some commonality that tends to fall across them? Otherwise, I think we're going to lose our minds trying to chase 50 different regulations in different countries if we have to do them all individually?
I'm already losing my mind a little bit. Uh, yes, there is a lot of commonality. Uh, you can only slice the pie or the apple, so many different ways. I've been involved with in my short tenure here with questionnaires or customer inquiry from Argentina to Panama to uh, folks in the UK, I believe, and other parts of Europe. So I've seen a good bit already of what folks are asking about globally, and it's not surprising. It's fairly similar to what's being asked here in the States, though just through a different lens. I think some of the things I've seen internationally are focusing a little bit more on continuity and some certain regulatory requirements where I feel like here in the States, we're focused more on are you doing specifically this one specific control as opposed to broader processes and quality management systems and things like that. And I think the global organization helps us be mindful of what everybody's looking for. Our customers across the globe inform our strategy here and how we move forward. And that's a perfect example of balancing local needs as to global needs to make sure that we can answer or meet our customer requests globally. A good example is we're collaborating with our data protection officer for GDPR and CCPA and looking to manage those processes together and work them together so that we have a consistent process and message to any constituent that has privacy concerns. And I think that only helps us to be a stronger organization by collaborating for like-minded areas.
Yeah, sure. And I think that, there's certainly commonality in the premise or basis of those regulations, right? So even though the reporting requirements perhaps may have some variance in them, anybody who's looked at those regulations quickly learns that there's very little technology directive in most of them, certainly as it pertains to IBMI, which tends to be a challenge. We're not really sure how to translate that. And so really what it comes down to is that many of them just simply speak to the necessity to harden security, right? And so what we've got to be able to do is translate that requirement into the equivalent controls that we deploy regardless of the platform, but certainly inclusive of IBMI, is how do we stand this server up in a way that the profiles are adequately configured and the security controls are defined clearly. So when you're kind of building business cases, which presumably you're doing for building your own budgets and everything else, where are you getting your information? Are you leveraging cost statistics from the cost of a data breach? I know a lot of us quote those numbers. Do you have people on a team that will bubble this up, or is this just kind of a collection of things that come across your desk through the year that you say, yep, that's a priority for us, and therefore we need to estimate costs and budget for that?
I think it's a mix. I lead with my experience, which is probably 80%, and that experience is leveraged off of my peers and colleagues that I stay in touch with and rely upon. I mean, that they're truly a good source of information to get through some of the fog of the noise out there. Though, if you've been around for 10 to 15 years in security, you kind of understand what the priorities are. Going a little bit of philosophical, my approach is focus on the fundamentals. So you want to be able to do the basics, the fundamentals well, and do them repeatedly well. And then as you get those in place, then you're able to mature that program. So basically avoid the shiny object syndrome and whatever the latest and greatest product is out there to address the latest threat that's been identified. But if you can do things like patching and passwords and permissions correctly, it's only going to help mature the organization that much better and realize better benefit from those evolving technologies or more cutting edge technologies. I mean, it's the similar analogy of putting let's say a gold plated roof on a shack, right? You don't want to layer in technology on a faulty foundation. And a lot of the things that you see in the media honestly could be covered with the basics. How many times do you see in the media that somebody didn't change a default password, but they label it as hacking? It's like, well, wait a minute. There should have been a good practice in place. Anytime you incorporate new technology in an environment, it goes through some sort of hardening process, and passwords and things of that nature are addressed up front, not after the fact.
Absolutely, and that's certainly a commonality with IBMI is when we look at a lot of systems, we do see that even reasonable practices are not being followed, and therefore when there is a breach, if that breach is even noticed, you can't really blame the server, right? Because if we're not going to leverage those controls. So you talked about the media. Do you think that the security incidences that we read about, do you think they're kind of overstated, understated in their volume? Is this as big a problem as most of us think it is, or is this something that is sensationalized a little bit?
Well, that's a loaded question. Yes, it is very sensationalized, absolutely. And this is not intending to sound alarmist or anything, though I believe that it's understated the significance of security events. It very much understated, but I think it's also because it's a misstatement as well. There's really not a great definition out there of what is a security event, quote unquote, in the media. But as I mentioned, somebody who didn't change a default password is almost held to the same critical stigma or review, just as somebody who didn't patch a particular web server, or somebody who didn't patch some critical infrastructure piece, or somebody who plugged in a USB key that had malware into a protected network. And so we're treating them all the same. But with that being said, I don't know who has 100% visibility into everything going on in their network, let alone some independent party to validate that.
Sure.
So to summarize, I definitely think it's understated, but it's overuse of misstatements and some of that fear, uncertainty, doubt in the media that's kind of creating this fog around security.
Yeah, and I certainly get asked frequently about, well, give me a list of IBMI servers that have been breached, and the reality is that information really just isn't available to us. There is one documented case of what was referred to as an AS400 being breached that was published in the Verizon data breach study a few years ago, and 100% was misconfiguration, right? And that's certainly an area that we see a lot of consistency is not so much that the server has been hardened and somehow the criminal managed to sneak in through some unknown entry point. The doors have just been left wide open, and in many instances we're fully reliant on the perimeter layer, right? We throw that firewall up and we think everything is good. Is that something that you see as a primary mechanism still in this day and age, or is while a firewall of course is extremely important, has its importance lessened a little bit over the years as we talk about applying more layers beyond just that single control?
Well, first I want to address your comment, which I think is very pointed about, give me a story or give me a news article about an IBMI being hacked or being compromised. Like, well, that's absolutely the wrong mindset to have. I mean, that's the same thing of saying, well, give me the list of all the people that have gotten a ticket because they were driving without insurance. I mean, you're waiting to invest in something until you see it happen to somebody else. That's, to me, is the complete wrong mindset to have when it comes to risk management, to be as direct as that. Related to firewalls and layered security, absolutely you want layered security, though what's evolving is the concept of the extended enterprise. So you can have that firewall in front of your IBMI, but what else is your IBMI connecting to? How many other services are calling in or applications are calling in to get data? Do you even know where your data is going? And is that all even in-house? Is it getting called out through some API to a third party for whatever purpose it might be? That's where the hook is to understanding not just the technology, but the people and processes behind it. There was one organization I was working with that had a data warehouse team. So I was told that, hey, go interview them. They know where all the data's at. Okay. Turned out that they're essentially order takers. Anybody could call them up, ask to run a special report, and they would run a report, package it up in Excel or whatever format, and ship it off to them without any questions asked. It's like, oh my goodness, you're shipping all this data around and you have no idea why. And that's the part that I think folks are missing on a little bit, because not only does that address to what we spoke to earlier, confidentiality, integrity, but also could lead to availability. You might have some great redundancy built into a particular web application that's customer facing, though it ties back into IBMI, you're not aware of it, you don't have high availability set up, you don't have other certain controls in place, that goes down and you have this cascading effect in your business and you're not even aware of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, according to the poll, 17% of attendees have experienced some kind of security incident. 17% aren't sure. The 50% does fall into the no. But one of the things that we've learned along the way, oftentimes with these types of events, is that we're not aware of these activities until much further down the line, right? And then we start doing the analytics and the forensics, and we discover that something's been happening for an extended period of time, unfortunately. In fact, many press releases related to data breaches start off announcing that this breach happened on X date, and then ultimately there's some amendments made to that to acknowledge that it does actually go farther back into the past than we originally anticipated. So I'd like to focus a little bit now on the Power Platform, a technology that certainly has an amazing reputation to have some of the best security available. But is it realistic that that server is just inherently secure? I mean, that's a lot of times how we kind of read that attribute, as opposed to a server that has a lot of controls that can be configured. Is it realistic to think that any technology is better than another if you don't give it some TLC as part of its configuration?
I love the philosophical questions, and I'm just going to go out and say no. That my personal approach is that there's nothing inherently secure. You might have situations where technology may be more or less targeted than other technology for vulnerability identification or probing. You might have more or less usage. You might have more or less criticality or likelihood. Though at the end of the day, for example, you could have a hardened server, but let's say you turn on FTP on that server and you don't know exactly what you're doing. Well, you just made that server vulnerable because FTP wasn't configured. So to say something is inherently secure and you don't need to worry about it out of the box, or put any policies or processes around it or out of the box, I think is not a great approach.
Good. Well, and the reason I say good is because I think the portrayal from the IBMI technical resources to management is that they have heard justifications for the purchase of this equipment based on the fact that it's highly available, that it is secure, that so many parts of it are built in and don't need to be purchased additionally. And I think it's important that that message be portrayed more accurately, and perhaps some corrections made from past conversations to explain that yes, the controls are there, but it is not inherently pre-configured. And so IBMI is extremely secureable in my vernacular, not necessarily secure.
I would agree.
Yep. Now, in many instances, the IBMI servers within the network are not directly exposed to the internet, and I still hear that conversation oftentimes when we're talking to customers, in that they're justifying kind of what attention they're going to pay to their IBMI platform based on whether it is connected to the outside world or not. Is it reality to think that a server is not connected somehow, some way, to every other server on the planet, right? Whether it's directly or indirectly?
I think the reality is that if you have that mindset, then you need to have a very strong security posture on your internal network. I mean, okay, if we're only thinking of two different zones on your internal network, the DMZ, the demilitarized zone that has systems that are connected to the internet, and then the zone that does not have direct connection to the internet, your IBMI is sitting next to workstations. It could be sitting next to a public kiosk. It could be sitting next to ports that are available through a public conference room or a cafeteria or a guest Wi-Fi. Who knows what else is out there? So you're presuming, or assuming rather, that rest of that environment is secure. And I don't think anybody can really say that. In definitely the small to medium sized business space, the enterprises, true enterprises, could probably get pretty close to that, but I don't hear of or am aware of anybody that's taking that assumption and simply ignoring the rest of the environment and pretending that there cannot be a compromise through some sort of interconnectivity, as you're mentioning, Robin.
Sure. Now, we host a lot of education-centric events for the IBMI platform, webinars and security tour events. If somebody's been and received some education, they're familiar with the technology, in that they know there are vulnerabilities that really should be at least discussed, if not remediated, what's the best way that somebody in that position would bring that conversation to the table? I think for many CISOs, they don't get down to the technology level, right, as far as individual operating system knowledge. Is that fair? I mean, is there some education that should happen for them? How do we inform management levels of the importance of this server in the infrastructure?
I think the first and foremost, depending upon the role in the organization, is clearly understanding what is the role that, let's say, the IBMI is serving for your company. What is the business impact? And even if you do a little bit of legwork to get some basics in place to quantify that and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, I've identified these top 5 things I think we should address. They'll have an impact on this, and this is the corresponding business impact. That's going to get some more attention as opposed to kind of running around with your hair on fire type of situation and saying, oh, we got to invest this and got to invest that to address these concerns. But if you can tie it to a business impact or a financial impact, then more often than not gets attention from other folks. And then you might not get a direct answer at that point in time, but you should at least get a call to action, say, okay, this makes sense. Let's dive into it a little bit further to understand the full impact to the organization, or let's get some outside help in to understand the full impact so that we can best inform our path forward from here.
Sure. And I think one of the items that we talk about frequently is documenting or auditing the role of the server, right? In many instances, this tends to be a black box. We don't have a lot of visibility to it, oftentimes because it is self-reliant. And so I think understanding what processes are on there is a very credible part of that conversation. I know I had a story one time of a customer who, not deliberately, but actually chuckled a little bit because they said they had been through some server issues where the server box had been down, and it was actually a technology that was being retired out of their infrastructure. They've been given the mandate that this thing wasn't heavily used, and it wasn't until the server was taken offline in an unplanned outage that suddenly discovered that so much more of their infrastructure was reliant on the technology, and it kind of got a renewed attention from management about how critical and important it was. Now, of course, we're not recommending to people that they go pull the plug on the server and find out what breaks, but I think understanding what runs on it is definitely a credible part of that justification cycle, right? And when we talk about, hey, this is a legacy machine or this is an old technology box, we have to understand what the capabilities are along with what we're running on there and perhaps how best we can deploy those in a modern data center.
Yep.
Looks like the consensus is that IT leadership does recognize how important the IBMI platform is, so that's good. I didn't expect to see that at 100%, but it just dropped a little bit. We got some other in there, so hopefully that's an idea. Doing some type of technology or process audit and sharing that with your IT leadership would be a way to accomplish that. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about funding, Chris. I mean, how do IT security projects typically get funded? Is it like most other IT projects?
Well, it depends. Is what are the drivers in the background? So bringing back to the regulatory and compliance item, there's something that requires investment to address compliance or regulatory concerns. You can likely get a compliance officer, legal, somebody else involved in making the case with you for that particular project for funding purposes. And if you have to do it or not do it, it's up to the organization to make the determination to accept that risk of non-compliance. But a lot of times that definitely helps with ushering funding requests along. Setting that aside, the best way is putting forward a roadmap and saying, this is how we want to evolve the organization. So you're not going to ask for $3 million tomorrow and do all these controls, because realistically you're not going to do everything. Even if you got $3 million, you're not going to do everything within 12 months. So the way I look at it is, all right, how can I put a roadmap together that is reasonable from a funding standpoint and reasonable to achieve in a 12-month period? Kind of have a rolling window of how you're able to update that over time and start building. So keep building the plane on that, and you're likely not to get everything you're asking for, but get a couple things on the list and keep working through it. Now, the other thing from a funding standpoint, which I think is often overlooked, is it's not hard tech. A lot of things that can be implemented to enhance security posture is processes, policies, education, training. And I'm not talking about phishing training and security training per se, but talking with other members of the organization, procurement, finance, folks that see new technology come into the company fairly regularly, and talk to them about, all right, well, let's make sure that we review these certain things when a new technology comes into play, or make sure that in the next round of policy acknowledgements that HR puts out a policy about some additional security practices or things to acknowledge. So you can help with, quote unquote, yourself with funding by doing some things on the process side and showing some of those little wins, some of those things that, hey, I can do these 3 things, upper management, but I need investment to do the next 3 things. Painting a picture with all of that together, I think, helps. Hey, Robin, I think I lost you.
Oh, no, there we go. So you had mentioned aligning business initiatives with security initiatives a little bit earlier. Is there anything the security officer or admin needs to know with regards to those business initiatives in order to build out recommendations on those security needs?
Absolutely, and it's more ideal for IT initiatives to align with business initiatives, and then security to align with IT initiatives. But that's a little bit of a extra leap there. For example, security is going to have really 2 broad mandates. One, protecting the enterprise, and then second, looking at the evolution of the company. But if the company is moving in a particular direction, either through acquisition, new product offerings, new development, you need to have that information to inform your product roadmap, your process roadmap. And so by understanding what the IT initiatives are, what the business initiatives are, you're able to start planning for change that's coming down the road. So you're not asking for funding for $100,000 and in 18 months it's a moot point because the business changes or IT's changed major process or something to that effect.
Sure. All right. Well, let's talk about kind of what action can be taken. What do we do next? So one of the things that certainly we see in the headlines and is this just endless parade of data loss and impact on consumers. And I think there's very much a consensus that people are becoming, in essence, breach weary. Is that something that impacts businesses as well? Are there organizations out there perhaps that look at cybersecurity as an inevitable event, and therefore they're going to invest more in perhaps cybersecurity insurance and mitigation than they are in prevention?
I'm sure there's folks like that out there, and that's not to say that they're necessarily wrong. One good lesson that I had over the years was that any 2 people can agree that the facts are accurate, but then the risk or impact could be different through those 2 people. And it could be a very reasonable, individual on the other side of that conversation. So not to say that's wrong, it's just that's not the path that I would take personally. I think insurance and some of those mitigating controls or risk offsetting controls are good to have, though. Again, I come back to the basics, and a lot of things can be addressed by simply doing the basics well. And the reason why that folks don't do the basics well is because they're hard. To actually say that you have a robust patch management program across your entire environment, regardless of whatever system it is, that's not an easy thing to do. And expectations are high for that, and they're treated as a mundane task, as simple as going to go fill up your gas tank. It's not as easy as that. And I think some of that awareness, bringing the concerns, bringing the challenges out of the shadows are going to help. And yes, folks are breach weary, though it's more about hearing that same story, that same bland story that, yep, we had a breach, we're doing everything we're supposed to, we don't detect that data is being misused, but don't have any concerns. Well, you don't know any of that information. That's what you're saying, and it's fine, it's reasonable, you can say that, but you really don't know if data is being misused or not. You don't know if someone's going to drop that information to a malicious actor and they're going to leverage it or attempt to leverage it down the road. And so really thinking about what is rational for good business practices to have in place, and again, asking for investment into some good practices and explain the complexity for it and understand how that impacts the business and really makes that financial connection or that availability connection or whatever is important to you and your organization, I think is only to be helpful to get over that hurdle of folks rolling your eyes when you start mentioning security.
Yeah, I agree completely. I had a breach notification that I tweeted about, and it buried in there in fairly large print was, we take our customers' data security extremely seriously. There's nothing more important to us. And I thought, well, that's an interesting statement to be putting in a breach notification, right? Because obviously there was more to it than that being their number one priority. So always interesting to me. And the concept of cybersecurity insurance, I don't know if that's something you look at or you contemplate, but I know certainly I have to explain to my kids when they say, well, my car's insured. I say, but you've got to take certain care of it, right? You've got to take the keys out of it and not leave valuables on display when you leave the car unattended. And presumably it's the same thing with cybersecurity insurance. They're not just going to cover you no matter what. I have to assume that there's an expectation of some basic controls there. Otherwise, the insurance company is going to do everything that they possibly can to get out of paying that claim.
Yeah, absolutely right. Most insurance companies have an underwriting process where they will perform a security review, some sort of interview, some sort of questionnaire, some independent third-party assessments. And there's definitely clauses in there that you need to abide by in order to ensure your policy is enforceable. Though, unless I'm stand corrected, there's no legal definition today of what's reasonable security or good security practices.
Sure.
So some of this vague terminology that you might see in insurance policy, could wind up being a point of contention. You believe what you have is reasonable, your insurance company doesn't. They might choose to contest the policy and dispute whether or not your event was covered. Not to say that the insurance companies aren't doing the right thing, but it's a complicated product to have, and it's not a silver bullet, but it's something that you could use to help supplement your program, but not replace your program.
Yeah, definitely not a simple, easy answer as perhaps some might purport it to be. As far as what we do next, one of the questions I always ask people is whether they have been through the process of a vulnerability assessment. And I think we tend to do that frequently on the network side. We're testing the perimeter wall to see if there are ports that are open incorrectly or without expectation. And we're having the expectation of always being an outside attack. But as many of us state, the IBM iServer is inside. We want to layer that security, not put all the eggs in one basket. And so from HelpSystems, you do actually have a couple of options here. One is the infamous security scan that we do for hundreds of customers every year. There's no charge to accomplish that, and certainly would invite people to take advantage of that offering if it's of interest to you. If you have budget assigned for some type of formal risk assessment, or the security scan has justified for you the necessity for it, we do also perform more audit level risk assessments. So a lot of customers take advantage of that annually or quarterly based on regulation requirements, but definitely something that gets much deeper into the weeds, and we can handle both of those. I've talked a little bit about management understanding the role and value of IBMI, and Chris, you added your perception there that no server is ever immune to the necessity for good security. If your management doesn't understand perhaps the full role and value of IBMI, one of the things that we always recommend is that we may perform a process audit, and that helps identify those workloads that are running on the server that comprise critical applications or functions that if they were offline for an extended period of time due to malware or to servers being down, then it would be extremely problematic. It's good to know those things, kind of, I guess, the soft equivalent of pulling the plug that I mentioned earlier. We want to build a business case ultimately for what would be the impact from data loss and business interruption. So while data loss prevention is a big part of what we're trying to stem, we also know that business interruption can come without necessarily entailing data loss. And we want to accommodate both of those things based on the information gathered from the vulnerability testing, from process audits, so that we know the potential impact across the business for any unplanned outages. Then when it comes to actually remediation, whether it's the acquisition of software and the deployment of that, or whether it's leveraging the built-in IBMI facilities that we have come to know and love but underutilize, then we recommend a project-oriented approach. We know, and Chris, you've mentioned that you're not going to spend millions of dollars in a single year and try to roll out 15 different solutions, because it's just not feasible. And what ultimately happens is we fail. So it's much more important that we prioritize those mitigations into things that would be deemed high risk and also high likelihood of them occurring. And we work on those remediation activities first, and that allows us to better budget for the costs and the resources, whether it's human resources or financial resources throughout that year, and then we can build a multi-year plan. And Chris, I assume your radar is further out than the next 30 days or the next 12 months, that you've got things that are there that potentially are going to take much longer to implement and are things that are evolving today.
Yes, sir.
Yep, I would assume. Many of you are familiar with HelpSystems and the investment that we've made in the security space, and certainly we appreciate the business that many of you have done with us. We are the premier IBMI software provider. We have the PowerTech brand within our portfolio, and this is something that I represent within HelpSystems, have done so now for over a decade. PowerTech is not only an IBMI brand, we do have multi-platform solutions within that name, and that's something that a lot of you are not familiar with. So we certainly invite you to understand that, and we'd be happy to share that information. In conjunction with that software, we also know, as Chris said, that the foundation is critically important. IBMI has a lot of security functionality in it, but I know from being the author of the State of IBMI Security Study that many of us are underutilizing those controls. So we have services, either bespoke services or managed services, that can help you manage that and take advantage of what IBM has featured in the operating system. And those teams are led by Carol Woodbury and Pat Boats, names that you guys are probably familiar with as well, and very well-known speakers and educators in the IBMI security space. And they have a fantastic team of operatives who can assist with everything IBMI. From an investment standpoint, my fourth bullet there is perhaps a new one for some of you in the IBMI space. We've done a lot of large acquisitions recently that have expanded our own security offerings and bringing new brands to the table. And we're very, very excited about that, helping HelpSystems grow into the market leader that it is. So we definitely are continuing to invest in IBMI, but that is not an exclusive investment. We know that many of you are running other technologies in your data center, and we're excited to bring solutions to those as well. If you have any questions, feel free to send those to the question panel. I'll be happy to answer those. I'm going to leave you with just one last poll here as we close out. It's been a pleasure, Chris. Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and expertise. It's always good for us in the trenches to know what the IT management teams are contemplating, what they're thinking about, and certainly helping us to define the way forward in defining needs, and that of course is going to lead to provision of budget, hopefully, and a better security stance in the long run. All right, looks like you guys are reporting lack of budget is a significant challenge to you. Chris, not a big surprise. It's time you pay up, man. Those CISOs need to write some checks so that we can get these things done. Time and manpower, certainly, again, another challenge. Managed security services can be very beneficial in that space. We're running our business, and that's ultimately what our role is. And so if you can look to outsource some of those things, we would be happy to assist you there as well. So I appreciate that insight, and thank you for sharing that with us. Chris, any closing thoughts before we get done here?
My last thought to say is if budget is the biggest concern, there's more than one budget within the organization, and there's likely more than one executive stakeholder that has some keen interest in your system that you're working to maintain. So go seek those folks out and build a message across upper management or across the C-suite, and that could probably at least be another avenue to explore to maybe get a little budget from several different people as opposed to one big budget from one person.
Yeah, fantastic. And the audit budget tends to be different from acquisition budget. So, like you said, there's different buckets that sometimes customers pull from. If you would like more information on our solutions, feel free to head out to HelpSystems.com. If you're interested in performing one of the free security scans and starting there, we would be happy to do that. If you've done one before, but it's been more than a year, I would say let's run another. No cost or obligation in doing that. You can also send an email to info@helpsystems.com anytime you have a security question. We'd love to help our customers and the IBMI community, which is why we do these events, and we look forward to speaking to you on a future one. Chris, again, thank you. It's been a pleasure having you here join me and give a new voice to the conversation, and look forward to speaking to everybody again soon. Take care, everybody.